All right, it is 3:01, so we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I am Autumn Shook. I'm the inspection manager for the food safety program within the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Thank you for joining our seventh, yes, I said seventh, monthly food safety webinar series presentation. This one is titled Fermenting Food Safety at Retail and Food Processing. I'm going to give you some housekeeping tips if this is your first time joining one of our webinar presentations. All of the participant microphones are going to be muted throughout the webinar. You may submit your questions during the presentations using the Q&A button. It's at the bottom of your screen. We really do encourage you to type in those questions as we go along through the presentation, rather than waiting to the end to type it all in. We will be answering those live though at the end. The regulatory considerations for what's covered today is applicable to those facilities in Kansas. And this session is going to be recorded, as I'm sure you heard when you logged on. We're going to post this recording online for those people that weren't able to attend today but wanted to get the information. After this session, a really important email is going to come with a link for you to take a survey. It's very fast, I promise you. Those ideas that you give us will give us ideas for future outreach. So today we have two of our staff speaking. This team is based out of Northeast Kansas. They are part of our food processing team. We have Daniel and Jeffrey presenting. We hope that you learned something new today. Let's get started.
Today we're going to be talking about fermenting food safely in retail and food processing. My name is Daniel Bauer, and later on you're going to be hearing from Jeffrey Maiden, and we are food processing inspectors for the Food Safety and Lodging program here at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. So let's get right into it. Now, we all love our fermented foods. They have a special place in our past and no doubt will play an important role in our future, both economically and gastronomically. They've been around for thousands of years, and fermentation was the primary method of food preservation for most of the world until this last century. But that doesn't mean that they've always necessarily been safe. And there's so many different varieties of fermented foods, including wine, beer, mead, breads, cheeses, pickles, kombuchas, yogurts, kefirs, sausages, vinegars, tempeh, and I could go on. And while we tend to romanticize them, as evident by these beautiful pictures we were able to find, that doesn't mean that they're without their risks. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about these specialized processes and some of the considerations that you need to have whenever you're manufacturing them. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about the types of fermentation. So fermented foods can be best defined as foods made through the desired microbial growth and enzymatic conversions of food components. And that's according to the NRGH, Nature Reviews Gastroenterology and Hepatology. Now there's three main types of fermentation. First, there's alcoholic fermentation, which would convert sugars into ethanol and CO2. Generally, yeast do this, though some bacteria can as well. Second, there's lactic acid fermentation, where sugars are broken down and converted into lactic acid by lactic acid bacteria. And finally, there's acetic acid fermentation, wherein the ethanol and other chemicals are converted into acetic acid by acetic acid bacteria. There's also molds used in these types of processes, though that's more of an enzymatic reaction rather than a metabolic pathway. And one thing to keep in mind with these specialized processes is that due to their dynamic nature, things can and sometimes do go terribly wrong. Just some examples here. In 2013, an E. coli outbreak in Korea ended with 230 school children sick from 7 different schools, wherein all of the kimchi came from the same manufacturer. It turns out that the source was contaminated cabbage. So these are some things that we need to be considering whenever producing fermented foods, not using contaminated produce, making sure that our fermentations are complete and that we don't use faulty equipment and that we're using hygienic storage. Another example from 2013 is when the Culture Kitchen had to recall their cashew cheese after 17 people became infected with salmonella. Testing found that the contaminated cashews were the source of the outbreak and that the co-packer had had multiple critical equipment malfunctions, like an uncalibrated thermometer, and there was no kill step involved. Now, the public health concerns and hazards that we encounter can be broken down into 3 categories. We have the physical hazards, the chemical hazards, and the biological hazards. And we're going to get into these 3 a little bit more here in the coming slides. So with regards to physical hazards, we want to make sure that our equipment is functioning properly. We need to ensure that it's soundly manufactured, sanitary, easy to clean, and not so old that it's falling apart. And you don't want rust particles flaking off into production. And that's something to be mindful of because these fermentations can get quite acidic and it can corrode certain pieces of your equipment. So you need to be watching out for those types of things. There's also the potential for physical contamination from the jewelry that some of your employees could be wearing, or the stray pen falling out of the shirt pocket. And with regards to chemical hazards, proper sanitation is a key component to protecting fermented foods from spoilage organisms. Cleaners and sanitizers need to be correctly prepared with concentrations measured to ensure that they're adequate and effective and within the manufacturer's specifications. Too little sanitizer allows for the potential of the growth of harmful microorganisms, while too much can even become an adulterant in and of itself. Molds can cause a chemical hazard due to the mycotoxins that they produce. While most molds do prefer room temperature for growth, they can also grow steadily under refrigeration. And there could also be pesticide residues on the produce that you're using to manufacture your product. So careful sourcing should be considered there. Finally, we have the biological hazards. Now, these are kind of the worst offenders of pathogenic microbes that could be involved in the fermentation process. And while we won't go into all the specifications of who these bacteria are, these are some that you need to be aware of. A Clostridium botulinum is responsible for botulism and prefers anaerobic environments. Listeria monocytogenes can grow under refrigeration. Staphylococcus aureus can be passed around through bare hand contact. Your facility needs to be to understand the risks associated with these pathogens and how to control for their growth. So how do we control for these hazards? Well, there are many different ways that we can control them, but a few to consider would be actually your product formulations. So your product formulation needs to include considering FAT-TOM, which is an acronym that we'll go into further detail on a little bit later here. You can also use the salinity of your product or the salt concentration as a control, as pathogenic microbes cannot grow in certain salt concentrations. You can also make sure that you're using approved sources for your starter cultures and raw ingredients, making sure that your recipes are based on sound research and that have been tested and proven to produce stable and safe foods. You can ensure that you have good sanitation practices throughout your facility and are implementing hurdle technology, which we'll also speak a bit about later. And finally, you can ensure that your facility is adhering to the current good manufacturing practices, or CGMPs. Now let's get into FAT-TOM here a little bit, which would be an acronym where F is for food, wherein foods that are high in simple sugars, carbs, or proteins are most likely to support the growth of bacteria. A is for acidity, as most pathogenic bacteria grow above pH of 4.2. The first T is for time, and this relates to the time that the food is held. E. coli populations can double every 15 to 20 minutes under optimal conditions, and listeria can increase in food by half to 1 log per day under refrigeration. And the second T here is for temperature, and most pathogenic foodborne bacteria do not grow readily below 41 degrees Fahrenheit or above 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So you got to remember your temperature danger zone. O is for oxygen, meaning exposure to air. And most pathogenic bacteria grow well in the presence of oxygen, with the exception of Clostridium botulinum, which actually prefers anaerobic conditions. So any fermentations that are happening in anaerobic conditions, you need to be aware of the botulism concern there. And M is for moisture content. And moisture content is actually measured in what we call water activity. And so the higher the water activity, the more water that's available for the metabolism and growth of the pathogenic bacteria. Now, hurdle technology is a great method of control in which 2 or more of those previously discussed techniques are used whenever one is not effective to control the pathogen that you're worried about. So for example, you could use a combination of low moisture content and salinity, or salinity and acidity, or time and temperature as a control. And with regards to how you're initially inoculating your fermentations, we strongly recommend the use of starter cultures from approved sources. Now, we understand that there are some traditional practices like natural fermentations using the native microflora of your facility or the product itself, or backslopping using the dregs from your previous ferments. But we don't really encourage the use of those methods. If you're going to be using those methods, there's the high potential to unintentionally amplify a population of pathogenic bacteria should your previous batches have become infected at any point. So it's for those reasons that we really encourage the use of a commercially prepared starter culture from approved suppliers that offer a letter of guarantee for the purity of their culture. Starter cultures also offer the benefit of a rapid beginning to your fermentation not allowing those pathogens to take hold and compete. And it offers reliable outcomes. Now that's all from me, and you're going to hear from Jeffrey next, and he's going to be discussing a bit about the differences between safety versus quality and some of the regulatory considerations. Jeffrey?
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Jeffrey Maiden with the KDA Food Safety Program. When considering fermentation, safety and quality considerations are extremely important. Food safety is concerned with controlling hazards, and similarly, food quality focuses on wholesomeness and sensory appeal. When properly controlling fermentation processes, operators achieve consistent, safe, quality results. There are various types of fermentation, as we have discussed, and each process must consider its own nuanced hazards that come into play based upon raw materials being used, time and temperature, various storage parameters, and there are a variety of other factors that can result in different outcomes depending upon the process at play. A product evaluation performed by a process authority is sometimes necessary to determine if temperature control is required for a product. For example, products with pH that are low enough, meaning that this product is acidic, oftentimes denote that those products are considered shelf-stable for safety purposes because microorganisms cannot grow in them. Additionally, product evaluations can be performed to determine various product parameters that impact microorganisms' ability to grow. What is a HACCP plan? A hazard analysis and critical control point plan is a tool used in the food industry to identify hazards within a production system and control them through monitoring and documentation. The goal of such a plan is to identify, monitor, and reduce risks in a food system. These plans are typically used in retail settings. What is a food safety plan? A food safety plan is an evolution of HACCP and is typically used by food processors. These plans contain an updated version of a HACCP plan, as well as extensive documentation of all parts of the food system supply chain as regulated under the Food Safety Modernization Act, or 21 CFR 117. When developing your own plan, if required, based upon specialized processing, a firm can collaborate with KDA Food Safety by requesting HACCP plan templates, submitting HACCP drafts, and receiving plan revisions and approval. Here, we've laid out a flow diagram for a kombucha process demonstrating how an operator might go about laying out the flow of products throughout their operation and which steps the operator identifies as being their critical control points, or CCPs, within that HACCP plan. Those CCPs demonstrate a need for specific hazard monitoring by identifying what those hazards are, what the limits are for that monitoring, and documentation and record keeping processes to demonstrate that the monitoring is occurring in a review process so that management can periodically verify that the process is working and being followed as expected. We've put together a chart here that talks about fermentation and those specialized processes in various types of products that utilize them. Do those products need to be evaluated by a process authority that we have spoken to a moment ago? Do they need a specific food safety plan or HACCP plan, or possibly a variance? Also, what are those specific things? That is all determined in specific language throughout both food code as well as KDA documents related to HACCP documentation and variance requests. Notably, most fermented products do require some form of specialized processing documentation. At the very bottom, you'll also note that brewing and distilling do not. We've spoken about a variety of products that become fermented. A great guide for anyone to use in the state of Kansas, the Food Sold Direct to Consumers in Kansas Guidance Document. The link will be in chat and provided after the event. This document is maintained in partnership with K-State and KDA. It is updated frequently to address all sorts of trends and various products that are being seen throughout retail markets within the state. To summarize, it is an operator's responsibility to be understanding and an expert on their process. In doing so, to strive for compliance with regulations and food safety. Many of these fermentation processes that we have spoken about today must be precisely controlled for food safety to be maintained. In order to do that, oftentimes food safety plans are implemented to effectively monitor and record limitations within a food production process. In certain circumstances, operations are required to have licenses or registrations with multiple agencies or jurisdictions for their specific food products, such as brewing, bottled water, etc. To further discuss your circumstances and what your operation means, as always, please contact KDA Food Safety and your local inspector for more resources and a more in-depth discussion to what you're producing and what the regulations stipulate for that process. I hope you found the information we covered today helpful. If you ever have any questions about specialized processes or food safety in your operation, please feel free to contact your local inspector. We're always happy to help you operate both safely and successfully. If you don't know your inspector, contact our Manhattan office and we can connect you with our inspector in your area. You'll also find educational materials on our website to help you with all aspects of food safety. Now, I'll turn it over to Tara Jo, our training coordinator, for the question and answer session.
Thank you, Jeffrey and Daniel, for that wonderful presentation. Now we're going to start our Q&A session. If you have any questions, please make sure and add them to our Q&A button down at the bottom. In the meantime, I do want to let you know that we have both Daniel and Jeffrey here available for your questions, as well as Courtney Pearson, who is the district manager for our food processing team. All right, so we already have one question. So Courtney, I'll go ahead and throw this one out to you. Does kombucha require product testing?
No, not if you look at the chart that we have also in the fermentation webinar, you'll see that kombucha does not require product testing. It may require a HACCP or a variance.
Thank you, Courtney. The next question we have is stated that you guys have provided some good practices, but which ones do I really need to follow? So Jeffrey, I'll turn that question over to you.
Thanks, Tara Jo. So this is kind of a loaded question, and what I will say is that if you are a wholesaler, meaning you have a food production license because you are one business selling to another business, you are required to show that you are controlling your hazards based upon language in 21 CFR 110 or 117, which, as we've spoken to in this presentation, is good manufacturing practices or the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, right? So the typical way that an operator would demonstrate that they are controlling hazards within their system would be through a food safety plan, as we spoke to. Now, to take it down a notch slightly, from a retail lens, when you have a food establishment license, because you are selling directly to the end user or consumer, if you're doing a specialized process, and we gave you that chart in the PowerPoint, if you're doing a specialized process therein that speaks to needing a HACCP plan, you are required to have HACCP documentation, and prior to producing that product, have submitted a completed HACCP plan to KDA for review so that you can have feedback on it from us in regards to what our thoughts are on it, and you can get an approved plan so that your HACCP plan can be implemented appropriately based upon the hazards that you're documenting, that you are controlling throughout that process. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. We have another question here. This person would like to know a little bit more about brewing beer at home. Is there any guidelines that we can provide for brewing beer at home? Daniel, would you like to answer that question, please?
Sure thing. So we don't regulate food products that are made for private home use and made in the home, right? I would recommend that you check out the American Home Brewers Association. Is a great organization for home brewers, and then I would just encourage you to read up on sanitation practices, implement those in your home, and use those starter cultures that you can buy from a home brew store.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Remember, if you have any additional questions, please add it into the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. We have another question. What are the standards for monitoring pH during the production of fermented products? Courtney, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, yeah. So in general, packaged products must reach a pH of 4.6 or less, and unpackaged products must be less than 4.2. So you need to make sure that your pH is being checked after your initial process. And then again, 24 hours later.
All right, thank you, Courtney. We have a follow-up question for you, Jeffrey. With being required to show documentation that you're controlling for your hazards, would appropriate documentation be records of your CCP monitoring, or would additional documents be needed?
So in the context of a HACCP plan, the starting point of a HACCP plan is a hazard analysis, right? So we need to start with a baseline of how are we identifying the hazards in our system? What are they? What are we justifying to say they are either a critical point in the system or a non-critical point in the system? An example, a really easy example that we gave in the PowerPoint would be refrigeration monitoring, right? That's a critical point. If you're not refrigerating at 41 degrees or below, that's a problem according to food code. But do we need to monitor that every day? What's the frequency for that monitoring, right? And so that's all stipulated in writing in the entirety of the HACCP plan, from the step one of hazard analysis to identifying what your critical limits and critical control points are, to doing the flow diagram that we demonstrated. And as you map that out in your plan, not only are you creating the roadmap for your employees to follow, also you're in writing and documentation demonstrating that it's happening every time consistently, and that plan is being followed to a T every time it's produced.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I also want to add in that we do provide expertise here in our Manhattan office. If you have any specific questions about a HACCP plan or a variance or the process that you'd like to do, you can always contact our Manhattan office and we can walk you through that process as well. In our chat, we did have a question about the farmer's market guide and kombucha going again. Adam Inman has joined us, our assistant program manager. Adam, would you like to address that question that was sent to just the panelists?
Yeah, so the farmer's market, and now it's changed, the name is now the direct-to-consumer foods guide. The farmer's market is probably the main outlet for this types of foods. These are foods that are exempted from food license if they don't require temperature control for safety, and they're provided directly to the end consumer from produced in an individual's home or a shared use kitchen. The typical outlets are farmers markets, bazaars, craft festivals, and those types of things. So kombucha is a specialized process because it is a fermentation of the product that creates that. So what we do is, it's not probably don't need a full process authority review, but we need a product analysis, a product evaluation to start with, and then that will need to be produced under a license, and that will be required. If it's just for the direct consumers, it will be required to be produced under a variance and a supporting HACCP. For kombucha, the primary controls are sanitation. So bottom line for kombucha is that does require a license, and typically you're going to need to support the safety of the food, be able to test that for the pH, make sure that the process looks good. It's fairly straightforward. Again, the main control is sanitation.
Thank you, Adam. We have about 4 more minutes till our time is up. I'll pause for a moment here to see if we have any additional questions. I don't see any coming in, so I'm going to turn it back over to Autumn Shook, our inspection manager.
Great. Thank you, guys. Everybody did a great job. Hopefully everyone got their questions answered that they have. But like Tara Jo said, if you have additional questions or need some additional help, please reach out to our office. Thanks for attending this session today. Again, it is recorded and it will be posted on our website. And make sure that you register for next month's webinar. Next month, we're going to be covering a totally new topic. So it's going to be pet treat requirements. So this is going to be presented by our KDA Dairy and Feed Safety Program. So a total spin, right? Look for the survey after this, immediately following this webinar or shortly thereafter. And so that way it'll assist us in our future planning. So thank you so much for attending. Have a good day.